Hi there, and welcome to PodRocket, a web development podcast brought to you by LogRocket. LogRocket provides AI-first session replay and analytics, which help surface UX and technical issues impacting your user experiences. Start understanding where your users are struggling and try it for free at logrocket.com today. My name is Paul Mikulskis, and joined with me is Nicolo Ribaudo. He is the maintainer of Babel and a TC39 delegate. And Nicolo is joining us today to talk about source maps and how they work. And it's a fitting topic because LogRocket at its core is an application and service that helps you see what's going on for your user experiences and just in production. Heat maps and source maps help you find out what's going on in your code. So we're going to dig in deep, figure out where they're used, how they work, and how they're put together. So welcome to the podcast, Nicolo. Excited to dig in with you.
Hi, I'm happy to be here. Happy to answer any question.
So source maps feels like they go hand in hand with being the maintainer of Babel, right? Do those relate a lot in your day-to-day work? Did you get into Babel first and then you got really interested in source maps, or what did that transpire in your development career?
So actually, it's a very long path between the two. I started with Babel, and from there, I got into standards, into TC39. And then from TC39, I actually started talking with companies involved in standardization of JavaScript and of tools around JavaScript. And that's where then we got to source maps. So even though I have to implement source maps things as part of my Babel journey, that's not how I got really close to them.
Are source maps one and one with JavaScript in your day-to-day? Because Babel, it's a tool that is heavily in that ecosystem when you think about it. And that also kind of begs the question, are source maps used for more than what people might initially think? I'm debugging something in my browser console.
Yeah, so I would say source maps are maybe 95% for JavaScript. That's how people use them most, JavaScript or TypeScript. But then it's not just that. In theory, source maps could be used for everything. If you're writing some CSS code and transpiling it with post CSS, or maybe even some less or Sass code and compiling that, you're still using source maps. In theory, you could even use source maps for a C to WASM compiler. I actually had at some point some Chrome DevTools showing some C code that was actually some WebAssembly but transformed through source maps to show me what the original C code was. And I was able to step by step debug through that in the browser thanks to source maps.
So at its core, it's giving you observability, transparency into what's happening in your code. It could be any type of code. It could even be markup, call it CSS.
They're actually useful for whenever you have some build step that does something to your code and transforms it in some way, and then the browser executes that result of your build process. But then you want to debug that code that's running, and you want to be able to see what's going on relative to the original code that you wrote. And that's where you use source maps. So basically use them to pretend that all transforms in your build process did not happen and be able to debug the original code you wrote, even if that's not what's actually running in the browser.
All right, so it helps us debug, especially when there's build steps, transpilation going on. What are they, Nicolo? What are these magical things that help me debug?
They are just a simple JSON file, which contains a bunch of metadata about the file that you might want to debug, mostly metadata about what the original files were, so what the file names of the input to your build process was and what the contents of these original files were. And then it contains some weirdly encoded stuff. If you go look at a source map file that you might find in the output of your build tool, it's just a bunch of letters and commas that it looks like they don't really make sense. But actually, it's some special encoding that when decoded, it's mapping as almost character by character. It's mapping characters of the code that's run in the browser to locations in the original code that we wrote before transpiling. And they contain just a ton of these mappings. And so that whenever you, for example, place a breakpoint, the browser DevTools or the editor DevTools are able to look in the source map for the mapping corresponding to this breakpoint and apply it on the other side.
So it's literally a map.
Yeah.
Hey, there's this weird token, syntactical thing I can search for, and this is where it exists in my source code, mapping over to the source code. Is it one JSON file that you speak of, or is it many? Because the initial takeaway here is that's going to be a big honking file.
Yeah, it's one JSON file for each file you're running in the browser. If your build process generates 10 different files, you're going to have 10 source maps. There are ways to make them smaller. So for example, maybe instead of embedding all of the original files in the source maps. They can just link to them so that you don't get like a 100 megabytes JSON file. But in the end, it doesn't really matter if they're too large because they're not used in production, right? If some user opens your website, they're not going to load the source maps. The source maps are only loaded when you actually open the DevTools there. So when you want to debug, and usually if you're debugging, you're fine with fetching this huge file because that's not the day-to-day experience of using your website anyway.
Got it. So the size doesn't realistically matter. It's not shipped to the browser. It's not even shipped to production. I imagine that source maps could also be helpful in some development scenarios if it's not running minified code directly in production. Do you find this useful in your workflow, and how does that differ from any times that source maps might be useful in production?
When debugging outside of production, I still use source maps, even if maybe not minifying, just because, yes, I'm not minifying, so the code I'm running is like somewhat similar to what I wrote, but there are still so many differences. Like, even if I just strip TypeScript types or like be able to do some basic transform of only the more modern features, trying to leave my code close to the original as possible, these tools are going to move like things all over the place. And if I'm not actually running a browser the code I write, then source maps are helpful. When it comes to minifying, yes, they're even more important there because it's just impossible for a human to step through minified code and see what's going on there. And normally people minify more for production. You can still use source maps for production code. Like I said that they're not loaded by default by browsers, but if you have some production website, and you do open the DevTools, then the browser is going to try to fetch the source maps over.
Got it. Okay. So it's helpful in the development context as well because everybody's using TypeScript greater numbers these days. Even if it's not your go-to language, you're going to end up using it at some point, and it can be really useful to read the types. So useful in production for minified code, useful locally even if you don't have minified code. Depending where the source map exists, though, changes how it gets ingested, viewed, utilized, loaded. For anybody who hasn't ever dealt with a source map and they hear the word source map, probably the first thing they think of is Sentry. They've evangelized and socialized the common use of source maps when somebody might not have initially been interested in that section of web development. So if it's not Sentry and integrating with their CLI, how are source maps ingested? How are they produced? How are they loaded?
Yeah, so there are like two main ways source maps are used. One is the one I'm mentioning where you just open your browser DevTools, and it like untransforms your code. And that actually does not rely on any external service. It's just the browser itself fetching the source map from the same server where you're hosting your code. And that source map has been generated not by some like third-party provider, but by your own build tools. And this is like when it comes more to debugging, like real-time debugging when you step through your code and try to figure out what's going on there. But then there is this other way of using source maps, which is, for example, what Sentry does or similar companies, so these companies add some monitoring, right, to your application. Whenever there is maybe an error or even just some trace that you need to figure out, like what happened there. These providers will collect all this information, like all these traces or errors about your code somewhere. And these are the errors or the traces coming directly from the browser. So they're going to have information about the code that is running in a browser, which is maybe the minified code. But then when you actually try to look at these stack traces, they're going to apply the source map to it so that you see not what code was running in your user's browsers, but how that code maps to like your non-build source files. So there are these two main ways. I think for most people, actually, source maps is something that you probably don't even realize you're using them because like maybe you're using Webpack, Rollup, or any other like Babel, any tool that transforms your code. And most of these tools just generate the source map for you. You don't have to worry about that. And if you don't know you have source maps, you're probably not going to use one of those third-party services that like do all of this analysis and apply the source map to it. The only way you're going to interact with source maps is without even realizing that you just open the browser DevTools and they just work. Like ideally, source maps are just there and you don't notice because everything is working so well. Like source maps are doing their job so well that you don't have to think about that. And people start noticing that source maps are a thing when things do not work well. And so they have to figure out why their debugging experience is like feels a little bit off.
Right. Okay. So I think the realization that some folks might have if you're not familiar with source maps, maybe you're just using them, you didn't set them up as Sentry and source maps, two separate things. They're symbiotic. Source maps in production only, not necessarily true, also useful in development. source maps are produced by you at build time. It's not a special thing that's owned by any group or anything. All that being true and being said, it kind of begs the question of standardization and how are source maps produced. There's this big JSON file. What if they're different, Nicolo? I'm sure this way source maps are produced time over time changes. And does that process differ between preparing them for production, preparing them for development versus preparing them for a specific vendor like Sentry? Or do they rely on the same standards?
There are probably hundreds of tools that in some way interact with source maps. If you think about all the build tools we have, I don't know, like every 2 years, there is a new very popular JavaScript build tool, and they all implement somewhat the same support for source maps. And then we have all these other tools that consume source maps, like the browsers, tools like Sentry, even editors like VS Code itself can read source maps. For example, it uses them when you click on Go to Definition in your editor. And all these tools mean working on the same format, mean that we actually do need a standard. Like you cannot have a Chrome specific source map thing, because then all the tools need to implement the Chrome specific thing. And then Firefox would come with their own Firefox specific thing. And all the tools again have to implement the Firefox specific thing. And that just does not scale. So there is some coordination needed here. But the fun fact is that source maps are like maybe 15 years old at this point, at least the current version of source maps. And until 2 years ago, there was no standard. And everybody was just trying to copy what each other was doing, trying to reverse engineering how source maps worked. And there was like this Google Doc that some engineer from Mozilla and Google wrote down that had some instructions on how the decoding works and what various fields mean. But it was far from being complete and like describing the full reality of source maps. So yeah, everybody just had to look at what other people were doing and try to, kind of like you're in school, you have a test and you just look at the test on your classmate's desk and try to do the same thing. And like it was working well enough in many cases, but then we started hitting like all these edge cases where things actually were working differently in different platforms. We also started thinking, okay, if we want to evolve source maps and making them more powerful, how do we do this given that there is huge number of uncoordinated tools that all try to do the same thing without really a single central place to discuss these changes. And so 2 years ago, within T39, we gathered a group of multiple companies working on browsers, working on DevTools, even just companies that have a lot of developers writing JavaScript code. And so they need to make sure that the debugging experience for the developers is great. So we created this group and we took that Google Doc that there was, completed all the parts that were missing, made sure it matched all implementations, and published the first version of a source map standard. And now we have these meetings within T39 with all of these different companies where we try to think, okay, how can we improve the experience of debugging source maps? So we try to evolve a standard, but it's not just evolving the standard. They're like the people that have to implement the standard are actually in the room talking to each other.
Elizabeth here, producer for PodRocket. Did you know that we have a weekly newsletter? The replay is curated for what dev leaders are reading, building, and debating right now. Check it out in our show notes.
I assume that there's some difference between, you mentioned people are coming to the table, browsers, there's Firefox and Chrome, there's other runtimes being developed. Are there any differences that you notice given the recent standardization push in how these different browsers consume and then present source maps to us as devs?
So there are differences in the UI that browsers use. Different browsers support different features. There are browsers that are better than others at, letting you place breakpoints right in the place you want. Or there are browsers that only use source maps to roughly map the lines without, lines of code, without mapping the exact character indexes. But roughly they do all similar things. Something very positive I'm noticing about this source maps standardization group is that it's working very well, and people from all different companies, from all different backgrounds, really do have this shared having some specific additions we want to do to source maps to improve the debugging experience. Well, this is less frequent in larger standard groups where, yes, technically everybody has the same goal of making whatever the standard is about better, but then different people have different opinions about what better means, which slows down progress. While right now here in source maps, we're very compact in a specific direction.
Do you think that is part of the nature of the domain of what the problems surrounding source maps and user stories are? Maybe it's a bit more puzzly and rooted in a fundamental truth of what is good and what is bad to offer a good experience?
I think one of the main reasons is that it's a not very large group. There are a couple people working on DevTools at each of these companies. I don't know, Chrome has probably hundreds, if not thousands of engineers, but then you can fit all the engineers that work on Chrome DevTools in a single room. And the same is for other companies. Like I noticed that, for example, there is maybe 1 or 2 people working on DevTools for WebKit, which is like much smaller than how many people work on WebKit itself. And all these people so have a very much shared experience on how source maps work and what the problems with source maps are. Also, something important here is that source maps do not really affect the end user of the web. Like they don't develop a person that just navigates web pages. It's not like you add some feature to JavaScript and that will have impacts on end users because maybe it allows the browser to do things it was not able to do before. I don't know, loading files from the user's laptop, or it might make the browser slower as the user navigates through the web. Source maps really only affect the developers, given that they are only used either to browse DevTools or to these third-party DevTools, but it's like things that the final users the web doesn't interact with. And so it's much less scary to make a change to source maps because you're affecting a much smaller group. Yeah, you're affecting the developers and nobody else.
What about the way that the conversations around generating source maps, ingesting source maps, leveraging source maps in this group in conference and just from what you hear in the community? Is there discourse around web bundlers, Webpack, the developer experience of interacting with what is likely one of those tools in their day-to-day and how that dovetails with source maps?
Yeah, so we don't really talk about things like how you configure your tool or like how you make Webpack generate source maps. We only talk about, okay, when Webpack generates source maps, what information should it include in there? But in this group, we actually have one of Webpack maintainers, or we don't really have, I know, people from Vite, but we talk with Vite maintainers every once in a while, or like same for, I don't know, Rollup. Maybe it's not super active in our group, but we make sure to think about what tools like those need. Because yes, browsers can implement source maps, but then if nobody actually generates source maps the right way, it doesn't matter what browsers implement, right? So we need to have all these build tools on board, like all those bundlers need to basically do the right thing. And in some cases, one of the proposals we're working on is actually to make it easier for some of those tools to generate source maps, even if it does not improve the actual debugging experience or the implementation in browsers. But the easier we make to generate source maps, the easier it is for this to, the lower the bar is for all these kind of tools to generate them. And the more source maps we have, the better it is, just because their goal is to improve the debugging experience. So, yeah.
Now, if I was a user and I was making one of the token web app frameworks, meta frameworks, using Vite, using Webpack, insert other, Rollup, what do I need to do today to start interacting with source maps? Is it something that I would place directly in my Next.js Webpack config, in my Svelte configuration?
It really depends on what framework or build tool you're using. There are some tools where you explicitly need to ask them, please generate source maps now. If you're using Babel directly, by default, it does not generate source maps, and there is some option that you need to enable, or the same for Webpack, maybe also for Rollup. But then there are the larger meta frameworks, I don't know, Next.js, they just tend to do the right thing by default. And so they just make sure that the underlying tools that the user generates source maps, and then they just put source maps in the right place. And then the browser will just find the source maps without you really having to worry about it too much. So you should probably, depending on what tool you're using, just make sure that source maps are being generated. If it's not, just read the docs of the tool. There is sure an option to enable source maps. But yeah, ideally one day nobody will have to worry about them. They will just exist and be there and be hidden and just do their job.
And if somebody got that hooked up and they started interacting or noticing source maps for the first time in their local development, what are some tips you would give for getting the full juice squeezed out of that experience, getting the most that you can out of that source map?
So if you have multiple tools as part of our build process, first of all, you need to make sure that they're all properly ingesting source maps from the previous step, from the previous tool. Some common mistake I've seen is that you have, 3 tools, one after the other, and maybe 2 of them generate source maps and then the third one is not, which means that all previous source maps are just wrong now. They're just useless because there is one tool in the pipeline that generated the wrong thing. And so it just broke all the connections. So if you have some process where you're putting multiple tools together, to make sure that source maps work, you need to make sure that every single tool is generating source maps and every single tool is ingesting source maps from the previous tool to propagate all of the information. Something else that people maybe don't really know, but it's very helpful when dealing with source maps, is that sometimes they're just wrong. When they're wrong, it can be a pain. And obviously report a bug to whatever tool generated the wrong source map. But what you can do in these cases is just go to your browser's DevTools and you can turn off source maps. All browsers have an option hidden somewhere to do so.
If they're wrong.
Because obviously it's better to debug with source maps than without, but debugging with wrong source maps is like the worst thing possible, because you think there is like, you think you're running some code, you think you're in some function, but actually you're just somewhere else, and that just doesn't work.
And what is one thing you think is coming to the ecosystem surrounding developer hygiene and source maps? Or what is similarly something you think would be really cool that could be enabled with the additional standardization and socialization of source maps? Maybe you're thinking of some tool, Nicolo, you're like walking down the street some days and you're like, it would be really cool if we could use it for this.
Yeah, so there is this new feature we're developing for source maps. It's called scopes. I mentioned earlier that source maps are basically just mapping points from one side of your build process to points to the other side of your build process. But code is not just, they're basically mapping characters, but code is not just a list of characters, right? Those characters have some meaning, like you might have some variables in there. You might have some functions that contain those variables. Maybe you even have two variables with the same name that like shadow each other. And so at some point in your code, you can see one of the two, and then some other point of your code with the same name, you're going to see another variable. And right now, source maps do not really allow reflecting all of this information, which means that when you try to debug your code and like to go step by step through it, you're going to see the right code in your DevTools. But then usually DevTools have all this extra panel with extra information. What variables are visible here? Are you inside of a function, or are you inside a loop, or like where are you? Or you can normally, when you're post debugging your code, you can open the JavaScript console and try to execute some JavaScript expression that uses the variables available in the local scope. And this doesn't really, source maps do not really make these operations transparent to build processes. So if you have a function that takes two parameters A and B and just returns A plus B, but then you have some build process that returns these two parameters to C and D, and then the function returns C plus D. So you have a source map that's mapping this new code that contains C and D to the old code that contains A and B, which means that if you try to debug in your browser the code that is running, that is the code that contains C and D, you're actually going to see A and B, and you're able to step through the code that contains A and B. However, if then like you check, okay, what variables are available here, you're still going to see C and D and not A and B. Or if you try to use A for something, the browser is going to tell you, no, actually A does not exist. I'm just pretending that A exists, but it's not actually there. So something we're doing now is encoding more information in source maps to allow DevTools to reconstruct all of this information. So the source map now is also going to tell the DevTool, look, here, there isn't really a variable A, but there was original variable A, and you can get its value by, checking what the value is of this variable C. And that's going to improve a lot the debugging experience. Tools are starting to work on experimental implementations of this. Browsers are starting also. Maybe as soon as your tools start supporting this, there is going to be some experimental option you need to enable to get this new feature. And it's going to have problems, but you could try whatever it is and see if it makes things better. And then if it makes things worse, just report a bug and disable it.
Got it. Okay, so this is really pushing towards helping the live debugging experience and understanding like the mappings of your tokens, the variables, and accessing them with this rendered map in a more creative way that allows you to like use what you see directly in the code. What was the name of the feature?
It's called Scopes.
Scopes. Okay, got it.
It's probably going to be difficult to Google for it by just Googling for scopes. But maybe if you Google for like source maps scopes or TC39 source map scopes, something is going to show up.
Nicolo, well, thank you so much for your time coming on and talking about source maps with us. It's a topic that a lot of people don't have the time or space to explore. So it's great to like have your deep knowledge of being in it to surface back up into our memory. I know you do some talks online, or you've given at conferences about this. Where would people find you? Do you have a channel in particular? Are there any conferences that you could think about that would help socialize source maps? Or similarly, are there any social handles where you post regularly?
So for me personally, I mostly use like BlueSky or GitHub to talk with people. But when it comes to source maps, we actually do everything on GitHub. So if you want to interact with us, you can Google for the T39 source maps GitHub repository. You can follow everything that's going on there. Or you can even open issues. It feels like we're this group of people that works on browsers and works on weird tools. But actually there is just a lot of just JavaScript developers interacting with us and giving us feedback and getting involved. And maybe even trying to design solutions to the problems that they have. Yeah, it's we're very friendly. It's very easy to interact with us. People just need to do it.
All right. So the TC39 source maps, GitHub, Nicolo, people can find you on BlueSky and GitHub. And yeah, you can go search up Nicolo on YouTube if you want to find some of the other conferences and hear him talk more. But thank you for your time, Nicolo. It was a pleasure having you on. And hopefully we'll have you back soon to talk about the direction of where the standardization push has brought us.
Oh, thanks for having me here.